Hello and welcome, everybody. We're going to give it a few minutes for folks to get connected. While we're waiting, you're welcome to type in the chat where you're joining us from this evening. So welcome to those who are just joining us. We're going to give it a few minutes for folks to get connected. While we're waiting, you are welcome to type in the chat where you're joining us from. It's always great to see all the different places folks are joining from. Sweet, we have all over Staten Island, Buffalo, University of Buffalo, SSW, awesome. Mohegan Lake, Poughkeepsie, Putnam County. So welcome to those who are just joining us. We're going to give it another minute or two for folks to get connected. While we're waiting, you're welcome to type in the chat where you're joining us from. All right, so I'm going to get started with a few administrative announcements and then pass it off to our presenters today. So closed captioning is available for today's program. In order to access that, you can click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. In addition, if you'd like to change your name, add your pronouns, you can do so by clicking the participants button and then clicking the ellipsis, the ... next to your name. And then today's program, we are also encouraging folks to do the loan forgiveness survey if you haven't already. We're advocating for loan forgiveness for social workers throughout the state, regardless of membership, regardless of if you're graduated yet or not. We want to hear from you about, your loans that you have so we can advocate for social workers throughout the state. So a couple more little things here. Thank you to our sponsors of this is a student series program. So thank you to our sponsors. This is all the different programs that are sponsoring us this year. And we are actually just at the end of this is our last program this year of the student series program. We do have a yearbook that is happening that you'll need to complete by Monday, May 20th. If you are interested in having yourself featured on our yearbook, you can add yourself by going to the link that I'm going to drop in the chat right now. Just a picture, your name, quote if you want. And then, definitely if you're still a student next year, keep a lookout for more things happening, next fall and late summer for future sort of monthly student series programming. Okay, so I think that's it on my end, and I'm going to pass the baton off to Dr. Vicki Rizzo and Dan Pipitone to get us started regarding New York State licensure.
So hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Meeting with students is one of the most fun part of my job. So I am, oops, very sorry. I turn my phone on at night in case my mother calls while I'm sleeping. So I'm Vicki Rizzo. I'm a professor and the interim dean of the School of Social Welfare at the University at Albany. I also have been a licensed clinical social worker for more than 20 years. And licensure is my absolute passion. I've been working on examining the licensure examination that is provided by ASWB and the biases that are presented in the exam. And so I've been working with colleagues in New York State to deal with the biases that actually create social justice barriers to licensure. So that's not the point of my talk tonight, but if you have questions about that, I will talk about that. And I'm so happy that Dan is here as well, who will talk about the LMSW scope of practice, which is really important for all of us to know about so that we're doing things that will not put us in jeopardy with our licenses. So I'm going to give it a brief overview of New York State licensure. And Nell is going to forward the these slides. The last thing I would say is I'm also the current president of the board of directors of the National Association of Social Workers, New York State chapter. My term is going to end at the end of June, but I feel very committed to this organization. So the agenda, I'm going to show you an organizational chart for the New York State Education Department, which is the Office of the Professions does license social workers. Talk about the levels of licensing. What does it mean to have good moral character? What is a limited permit before you get licensed? What's the LMSW, the LCSW? And I want to talk a little bit about the LCSWR because there have been recent and significant changes to this, and also unlicensed practice. So here is the New York State Education Department organization chart. So everything, all licensing is really overseen by the Board of Regents. And there's a secretary to the board, and then you have the Commissioner of Education and the president of the University of the State of New York, which right now is Betty Rosa. So then you will see that we have different senior deputy commissioners. So there's someone for public education, P through 12 and higher ed, public affairs commissioner, then you have the deputy commissioner, and then you will see that there are different commissioners, and there has been a recent change. The ones that is the most important to us is the professions. This is where all licensing is housed. So recently, Sarah Benson retired, and David Hamilton has been appointed the deputy commissioner. Prior to his appointment as the deputy commissioner, David Hamilton was the executive secretary of the mental health professions, which is where our licensing is housed. Now, Evan Seiden is our executive secretary here. So we're hopefully going to have a conversation with our new deputy commissioner soon about the licensing examinations. So social work licensure structure in New York State is there is a limited permit for a licensed master social worker. And this is before you become licensed so that you can graduate and get a job before you have a license. And then there's the licensed master of social work, which is you have a diploma from an accredited school and you pass the licensing examination at the basic level. Then there is a licensed clinical social worker and a licensed clinical social worker with the R designation. So one of the most important things, and this is something that students come to talk about on occasion, is what is good moral character? So under the rules of the Board of Regents, Part 28, there are proceedings to determine good moral character and to evaluate prior disciplinary history for authorization to practice in the licensed professions. So the determination of whether an applicant has authorization to practice a profession. So to be of good moral character is in accordance with certain procedures. So all information indicating that an applicant has been convicted of a crime or has committed an act which raises a reasonable question as to the applicant's moral character shall be referred to the Office of Professional Discipline, and it gets reviewed. So there are a couple of things here. One is that in the past, when you applied to many programs, licensed programs, there was a question that was asked. Have you ever been convicted of a crime, a felony, a misdemeanor, etc.? Because these are all part of moral character. Then there was a do not checks the box campaign in New York State where you could not discriminate against people and like judge their applications unfairly to graduate school because they may have done something when they were young or a long time ago that's not relevant now. So now on applications to social work programs, that box is not included. So what happens is you go to apply for a license and they ask you the question under good moral character. Have you ever been convicted of a misdemeanor or a felony? And then what happens is it has to be reviewed. Now, many times you can have people that write letters of character and things to like make sure that you still can get your license. But that is part of the licensing, and it really has to do with criminal activity. So what happens when you want to get licensed? So here you are at the end of your, trying to figure out how to change my view so that I can see better. That didn't do it.
Yeah, if you click maybe like exit full screen, might be at the top right.
Okay, so now we're on the limited permit. So when you graduate, you're not licensed yet. So you can submit an application and a fee for licensure and your first registration. So a limited permit allows an individual who has met all the requirements for licensure as an LMSW, except the licensing examination, to practice as an LMSW, provided that you're under the supervision of an LMSW or a licensed clinical social worker. So some agencies may require you to apply for a limited permit while you are waiting to sit for the licensing exam. So a couple of things. You have to submit an application. It's called Form 1, and a fee for licensure and your first registration, which is $294. You can apply for a limited permit, which is Form 5, at the same time or anytime after you submit your application for licensure. So the fee for that is $70. What happens, and this is true for sitting for the licensing exam and for the limited permit, your school has to verify the completion of the MSW degree, which is Form 20 now. It used to be Form 2, it's now Form 20. And you have to submit completion of coursework or training in the identification and reporting of child abuse offered by a New York State approved provider. NASW is one of those. You have to be 20 years of age and be of good moral character. Really important things under the limited permit is you have to be supervised by an LMSW or an LCSW only. You can't be supervised by someone that's not licensed. And you have to meet all of the requirements except completion of the examination. The limited permit is only for 1 year. No extensions are allowed. So once that 1 year of limited permit is over, it's over. And it requires an LCSW supervisor if you're doing any kind of practice with clinical social work. And if there is a provisional social work certification for schools that can substitute for the permit while you're waiting to get licensed. So the licensed master's social work. So the practice of licensed master social work and the use of the title licensed master social worker and the designation of that LMSW in New York State requires licensure as a licensed master social worker, which means you have to sit for the licensing examination. Here again, like with the limited permit, you have to be a good moral character as determined by the Office of the Professions. You have to be 21 years of age or older, meet the education requirements. So if you have gone to an accredited school of social work anywhere in the country, not just New York State, those are the educational requirements. And then you meet the examination requirements. You take the LMSW level examination and you pass it. And you complete coursework or training in the identification and reporting of child abuse. And, there is a new mandate for ethics and professional boundaries, but I did check, and that you have to complete not in the first 3 years, but by the when you have to renew your license after 3 years, then you have to complete that course. So for the LMSW requirements, what do you need to do? So you have to apply online or paper. I would recommend applying online because it's faster. There is a fee, $294. And you can online, you can do it by credit card. And then what happens is once you apply, your school has to verify the registrar's office completion of the MSW degree, which is Form 20. Form 2 is for people, graduates in other states. And then once all of that is done, you will be notified that you can sit for the ASWB Master's Examination. It's given daily across the United States. However, the number of sites in New York State have decreased. So you have to register with ASWB and you submit an application fee, and the exam is $230. So those are the main things that need to happen in order for you to get licensed as an LMSW. So when you get it, you pass the exam, you've met all the requirements, your initial registration is for 36 months after the date of licensure. For this first registration period, because you just graduated from school, you do not have to meet continuing education credit requirements. Once you go through the first 36 months, when you renew your license, you'll have to do 36 hours of continuing education credits every 3 years to continue your licensure. So if you change your name or your address, you need to notify the state education department within 30 days. Your renewal notice, you'll get it in the mail. I just got mine the other day. It'll be sent to you 4 months before the end of the registration period. And as I've already said, you're exempt from continuing education for the first registration period. So the scope of practice, Dan is going to talk more about the scope of practice. I include now, will these slides be available to folks on the website afterward?
Yeah, they will be available, and I can also drop them in the chat right now as well.
Okay, so I'm not going to say that much about the LMSW scope of practice because Dan is going to cover that, but I am going to say to you that it is really important that as a licensed master social worker that you only practice within the scope of your practice, which means you are not a licensed clinical social worker and you cannot provide that kind of treatment as a result. And Dan will say more about that. You can go to the next one. So what are some of the restrictions and requirements for LMSW practice? So as an LMSW social worker, you may only practice clinical social work under the supervision of an LCSW, an LCSWR, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist employed by the setting that you are working in. This is really important because as an LMSW, you want your supervision hours to count towards the 3,000 hours that you need to have in order to become an LCSW, if that is the path you are choosing to take. Not everyone chooses a clinical path. The LMSW permit holder, which would be you, can only practice clinical social work under the supervision of an LCSW. So it's really important that this rule is followed, and the setting must be authorized to provide clinical social work services and psychotherapy. So the setting that you're working in has to have an operating certificate to be a 28C clinic, to be a provider of mental health services, or they have a waiver to do that. And as an applicant, you must be supervised in accordance with the law and regulations. So at least 100 hours of supervision should be distributed over a period of not less than 36 months. And you should have 2 hours a month of supervision if you're not completing experience toward the LCSW. And you should have at least a minimum of 2,000 client contact hours in 36 months. Acceptable clinical experience for licensure is, unfortunately, narrowly defined in the education law, which it makes it difficult for social workers in some settings to qualify. So the law requires experience in diagnosis, psychotherapy, and assessment-based treatment planning to ensure competence when licensed. Acceptable activities are determined by the supervisor, but typically consistent with third-party reimbursement for psychotherapy and diagnosis as defined in insurance law. So insurance law really does dictate a lot of what is acceptable, the acceptable scope of practice. So other direct client activities, which is, a lot of what we do as social workers, case management, psychosocial assessment, supportive counseling, discharge planning, do not constitute acceptable experience as defined in law. And it does not meet the requirements for licensure. So individuals who are practicing social workers in hospitals, healthcare settings, they have to have, individual or group clinical contact hours that are things that are not case management and psychosocial assessments. So what does it mean to be a licensed clinical social worker in New York State? So the practice of licensed clinical social work and the use of the title licensed clinical social worker and the designation of LCSW requires licensure as a licensed clinical social worker unless otherwise exempt under law. So what does that mean to be exempt under law? In 2010, the licensure laws were passed, there were individuals who were certified social workers prior to the passage of this law who were grandfathered in, and they could become LCSWs. That stipulation has now grandfathered, so people cannot be grandfathered in as LCSWs anymore. Again, you have to be of good moral character, you have to be at least 21 years of age, have an education that includes a master's degree in social work, and the important piece here is you have to have at least 12 semester hours of clinical coursework acceptable to the department. So this is where the distinction between if you're a micro student or a macro student in a program, many times micro students or clinical practice students meet the 12 semester hours because of the way their program is structured. Many times, if you're a macro student, you may have to have taken electives in your advanced year that are clinical practice so that you meet the 12 semester hours. For example, in our program, students can meet 9 of the 12 credits in their foundation year of study because you're required to take courses that include a clinical coursework, and then they have to take one extra elective. You have to have at least 3 years of post-MSW supervised experience, and it has to be in diagnosis, psychotherapy, and assessment-based treatment planning, acceptable to the department. And you have to sit for a second exam, the LCSW level exam. And again, complete your coursework or training in the identification and reporting of child abuse. So of course, like the LMSW, you submit an application fee and an application online. The graduate school will verify the completion of your clinical MSW degree, meaning you have the 12 credit hours. So if you're a macro student, the graduate school just has to verify, yes, you took 12 credits of what would be considered clinical coursework. Your supervisor has to verify your clinical experience for licensure, and you have to pass the ASWB clinical examination. So the advice that I would give you here, starting out, is because people do switch jobs, is that when you're in a job with a supervisor who is supervising you for clinical experience, if you leave that job, you should get documentation of your clinical experience, number of hours, etc., with that person right then with a signature, so that when you go to your next setting, that you're documenting it all along the way, because what happens is people retire, people leave the state, people die. You want to make sure that you have your verification as you're moving along through your process towards the LCSW. You move to the next one now.
Next one as well.
Yeah, this one, the LCSW scope of practice. Can you go back one?
Yeah.
So what happens when you become an LCSW is your LMSW status becomes inactive at the next renewal time, and you just register to practice as a licensed clinical social worker. So this practice Under the LCSW, these are the things that you can do. You can diagnose mental, emotional, behavioral, and addictive and developmental disorders and disabilities. You can focus on the psychosocial aspects of illness, injury, disability, within a psychosocial framework. And you also can administer and interpret interpretation of tests and measures of psychosocial functioning, which you really can't do independently as an LMSW. You also can develop and implement appropriate assessment-based treatment plans. Also includes the provision of crisis-oriented psychosocial psychotherapy and brief, short-term, and long-term psychotherapy and psychotherapeutic treatment to individuals, couples. And this is all undertaken for the purpose of preventing, assessing, treating, and ameliorating and resolving psychosocial dysfunction, with the goal of, maintaining and enhancing the mental, emotional, behavioral, and social functioning of well-being of individuals, couples, families, small groups, organizations. So in New York State, we have had what's called the Licensed Clinical Social Worker Reimbursement, which is the LCSWR. So historically, New York State insurance law authorized a privilege to the LCSW license. This privilege, the R number, requires the LCSW license and 3 years of supervised experience in psychotherapy obtained after receiving the LCSW. So there's a separate application fee. So under the LCSWR, you get your LCSW, then you work for 3 more years as an LCSW. You complete at least 36 months and 24, client contact hours in diagnosis and psychotherapy. And then you get what is called the R number, which means you can be reimbursed by third-party payers, which is most insurance companies other than Medicare and Medicaid. But there have been some changes to this part of the law. So if you could go to so under this old law, the supervisor had to be have an LCSW with the R privilege, or it could be a licensed psychologist or a licensed psychiatrist. And the applicant had to pay the consultant who was supervising them. So this is what occurred in the past. You can go to the next one now. This, the R privilege for licensed clinical social workers was eliminated about a year ago. So there was an amendment to the New York State insurance law, removing the need for LCSWs. Yes, you do need to officially renew your licensure after the first 3 years, unless you don't want to be licensed, but most jobs require that you are. So now, with removing the LCSW, you don't have to demonstrate 3 years of supervised experience to earn the R privilege anymore. The existing R privilege for people who have the designation, they can keep that designation, but they are no longer processing applications for the R number. It no longer exists. And the reason is that most insurance companies now will just reimburse for the LCSW. You don't need to have the reimbursement privilege. You can find more information on the elimination of the R at the website that's included here. So there are some activities that can be provided by an unlicensed social worker in New York State. You can be a community organizer, a planner, an administrator for social service programs in any setting. And if you look at a lot of nonprofit organizations, if you look at who their program directors are, their program evaluators, many times they're MSWs. They do not have a license. You can provide consultation to individuals, groups, institutions, and agencies. You can be a faculty member. Most faculty members, if you look at the faculty members of most social work programs, many of them are not licensed as clinicians. It's not required in an educational setting. You can do research projects, program evaluation studies. You can provide advice and guidance and assistance to individuals and groups with difficult day-to-day problems. You can consult on agencies with problems and cases. You can do data gathering. You can serve as an advocate. You can assess, evaluate, and formulate a plan for action based on client need. You can provide training. You can provide administrative supervision, peer services. The main difference, if you look at this list, is that you cannot provide clinical services to individuals, families, groups, without a license. So I really want to thank Samantha Fletcher, who is the former executive director of NASW chapter, for helping me to develop these slides. And I think that now, and here's some contact info for NASW. If you have more questions about licensing, or you have questions, you can direct them to the New York State Education Department. We do like to hear from our members and non-members what's working well and what might not be working so well with the Office of the Professions in terms of scheduling the examination, time from application to getting notified that you have a license. So we'd like to hear about that as well.
Great. I think you're turning it over to me now.
I
A
am.
little bit more about scope of practice.
Yes, very important.
Great. Thank you for that. That was so informative. I was jotting down notes throughout. That was awesome. And thank you, Nell, for setting this up and for being so helpful and making sure that we're putting on a good program for everyone today. I'm Dan Pepitone. I'm an attorney. I'm in private practice, and I just shared my website link in the chat. I've been an attorney for about 17 years. I previously worked at a nonprofit law firm where we provided free legal services to people who could not afford lawyers. And I worked very closely with mental health professionals, specifically social workers, over those years. And with that, I went into private practice 3 years ago to support mental health professionals who were in private practice. And yeah, if anyone wants to reach out to me, please feel free to visit my website. I have a whole bunch of guides on issues that come up for people who are in private practice. So today I am going to talk more about the scope of practice for LMSWs. Last year we put on this presentation as well, and we got together a really good guide that's on the NASW New York State chapter's website. I just put it in the chat, and that's what I'm going to work off of. And when I say that we put it together, one person in particular, Olivia Hobbs, did a ton of work on it. And I don't know what happened in the last year, but they've made it so nice. I was very happy to see that last week. I love looking at it. And I'm excited to use it as a guide for you all today. So I'm just going to share my screen and I'm going to run through it a bit with you. Thankfully, Vicky touched on some of the really important issues that we're going to hit as we run through. Please let me know along the way too if you have questions. I think there's a very good chance we'll have a discussion about what this all means towards the end. So this guide, these are, the big issues that we've covered in the FAQ here. So check that out. I'm not going to hit every single thing, but I do want to just kind of touch on some of the big ones and, help you understand where to find these rules and regulations is really the ultimate goal here. So first, we have the question of where you find the rules and the regulations that cover professional conduct. As Vicky mentioned before, the New York State Education Department governs the practice. And with that, they have their rules. There's a link right here that you can open up to. We're going to touch on a few of the others as well. But they cover professional conduct and state that unprofessional conduct shall include practicing or offering to practice beyond the scope permitted by law, which is a really important thing. And this is really where this all comes down to today, right? and gets really challenging for LMSWs who are moving forward. So we're going to dig into that a little bit more. Also a bit more broadly, the regulations state that it's unprofessional conduct for LMSWs and LCSWs to do certain activities, which maybe are a little more clear cut than when we're dividing between LMSWs and LCSWs, where there might be some gray area in the terms anyway. But these two areas that social workers are not allowed to do includes prescribing or administering drugs and using invasive procedures as treatment and more. So yeah, the New York State education law goes in a little bit further into what is included in professional misconduct. And again, that is the practicing the profession beyond the authorized scope. So keep that in mind. It does show up in various places in the law. So first we were talking about the rules of the Board of Regents, and then here it is in the education law itself. So a number of areas where it's governing. This would govern for disciplinary proceedings for those people who act outside the scope of the practice. They might run into the danger of having a disciplinary action against them. Again, we talked about the Office of Professions, which I'm sure you all are thinking about very regularly as you're moving in this direction. Here's just the contact information. I do have to say that I have had some luck, at least with what I do in terms of helping people form their practice, choose names, deal with the certificate of authority, where they're quite responsive by email to me, which I really like. So that's something to keep in mind as well. You might reach out directly to the Office of Professions with those things, but just to keep that in mind. So yeah, here we are at scope of practice generally. I'm going to work off of this section on the right side here about what is the scope of practice for an LMSW first, and then we're going to turn to the left side on LCSW. So as is defined in the education law, and this can be found on the Office of Professions website through the link that's here, pardon me. You can click here to get to definitions and see where it states what the practice entails. So I don't know if I need to read every single word here, but for the sake of it, it is the professional application of social work theory, principles, and methods to prevent, assess, evaluate, formulate, and implement a plan of action based on client need. And it gets into a little bit more of some of the actual work, which Vicki alluded to as well, talking about the administration of tests and measures of psychosocial functioning, social work advocacy, case management, counseling, consultation, research, administration, and management and teaching. As was put in the slides that Vicki presented, we saw this idea of engaging in social work advocacy, case management, counseling, consultation, and also what was mentioned was supportive counseling, which I think is sort of a big overarching way of considering where this line is drawn between the scope of practice for an LMSW and LCSW, who is permitted to engage in psychotherapy, which we'll hit momentarily. So we have a little bit about supervision here. And as Vicki talked about, and we might hit a little bit further too, there are certain placements where you're allowed to gain your hours towards your C. So we're going to head in that direction as well. So we hit kind of these broad strokes on the LMSW scope of practice, at least what's in the regulation itself. I think what becomes really important is to distinguish between what an LCSW and what an LMSW does. And so thankfully we have this laid out so nicely on the website here. And here is an overview in the first section of what the practice entails. But I want to just skip a little bit to what I see as these three big designations for what an LCSW is allowed to do, what the scope of practice entails that is not included in the scope of practice for an LMSW. And first and foremost, that is the diagnosis of individuals. Next is psychotherapy, as we talked about, and for the sake of it, I will use this definition. And we might dig into it a little bit more if people are so inclined with those questions. But psychotherapy in the context of LCSW practice is the use of verbal methods in interpersonal relationships with the intent of assisting a person or persons to modify attitudes and behaviors which are intellectually, socially, or emotionally maladaptive. And then the last of the three that I see is really, distinguishing between these two scope of practices is the development of assessment-based treatment plans. And yeah, these are kind of these big three moments. I think the psychotherapy is where things maybe become a bit more gray versus counseling as defined in the law as part of the scope of practice for an LMSW. I'm always curious to hear what people think, if they have a good way of distinguishing between this work. Beyond, I think some of it can get a bit gray. I don't know if anyone has anything to add there from the social work perspective. Well, this is a big section too. We've tried to get the Office of Professions to really weigh in and really help us define these things and, make clear distinctions between the work and what's in the scope of practice. And just about as much as we can get out of them includes them stating that LMSWs may only provide these clinical social work services of diagnosis, psychotherapy, and assessment-based treatment planning under supervision. So that's as much of a distinction as we're really getting from them right now. And you can see, of course, the importance, as Vicki discussed too, of having appropriate supervision and only engaging in these activities if you are properly supervised in the appropriate setting. Okay. Next, we're going to talk a little bit more about, I'm going to actually kind of skip over the setting. Vicki did touch on this a bit. There are other situations or other settings that people can be operating out of, like a personal service corporation, a PC, let's say, an LLP, a PLLC. Those, when you're putting in your application for supervision hours, are acceptable settings. I do always encourage people to really check in and make sure that, the setting that they're in really does have the registration that you think they do. And so you might want to double check to make sure that they're properly licensed or registered rather by New York State. There are other settings, again, sole proprietorship, a professional partnership, and Vicki alluded to also these other settings. I think this is what you were talking about around settings that are covered by the mental hygiene.
You're correct. That's what I was talking about.
Okay, great. Thank you. And also Vicki mentioned the entities that have a waiver as well. So skip a little bit here. Vicki alluded or discussed those who can supervise LMSWs, but you can find it easily here on the website. And a little bit more about what's included in the role and what kind of supervision is going to be covered. And experience was already covered as well. So for the sake of going through, I'm sorry, actually, I wanted to hit one other thing that was important and Vicki mentioned, and it might not be so laid out here on the NASW page, but through this section on the law, Vicky outlined some of the things that do not require a license, either as an LMSW or an LCSW. That is in section 7702 of the education law covering the practice. So you can see all these other activities that people can engage in. One thing that I will say too is, you know, when you are licensed, you do not just like hang up your licensure hat when you do certain activities. If you engage in these activities and you have the license, you are held to that higher standard that that license puts on you, even if you wouldn't need that license to engage in those activities. So it's really important that people keep that in mind. It's, you know, not really a turn on and turn off the licensure thing if you're engaging in the work. That can come up for people who might be coaching in other states that they're not licensed in. Those other states certainly can look at the work of someone who's coaching and potentially argue that the work is rising to a level of requiring a licensure, and that those people might be practicing without a license because of it. Okay. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on what might be considered supportive counseling versus psychotherapy, but those are important considerations for LMSWs who perhaps aren't pursuing their hours, or at least are working without proper supervision to be engaging in clinical work. LMSWs, this is a section here. While LMSWs are allowed to create their own private practice, but you have to stay within the scope of your practice that, you know, we're running through here today. And it's really important that people be mindful of those activities that they're engaging in, and that they let the people that they're working with really know. As far as my understanding would be, you know, the LMSW like period where you're licensed as an LMSW, the idea is mostly that you're working towards the clinical licensure. So being off on your own in LMSW practice, I think, can get a bit dicey. And, you know, being able to distinguish between what's supportive counseling and psychotherapy might be a difficult argument if there's ever a question of what kind of services you're providing and what you're specifically doing. So I would certainly encourage people to consider very carefully the work that they're doing if they go into private practice. And I think there's some misunderstanding on whether people can start their own practice and hire an outside supervisor, as Vicky went into, you know, and we talked about above in this on this page. You have to be in a proper setting, in a proper facility or other agency that's operating properly. You cannot hire someone outside to provide supervision to you. You need to be working under them properly in their organization. Or
Can I just add something here, Dan?
please.
As an educator more than as a clinical social worker, what I tell students when they are on the job market and they really know they want the LCSW in the long term, that you really need to say to the, you know, you are interviewing them as much as they are interviewing you. And you need to ask, am I going to get the correct level of supervision that I need for my LCSW? And really demand that you have that, because you really cannot. In the old days, you could hire someone to be your supervisor, but now it's a conflict of interest. So I would just encourage those of you who really are wanting, like your goal is the LCSW. That's not everyone's goal, because not everyone wants to be a clinician, which is great because there's room for social work everywhere. But that you really demand, that you don't shortchange yourself, that you really ask upfront, who's going to be my supervisor? Are they qualified to provide supervision for my clinical hours? Because that is really important for you in your journey as a social worker, and you need to make sure that that's in place.
Thank you. Yeah, I work with a lot of people who, right when they get their LCSW licensure, and I hear a lot of different stories about the supervision that people have had in their journey. And you really do see, I mean, it's a lot of time, right? 36 months, it's an opportunity to really learn with some great people and get a lot out of that 3 years. So I think it's important to scrutinize that and think critically about the supervision you're going to get early on.
The other really important piece around this is if you are an LMSW who's going into a private practice, making sure that that private practice is following the regulations for supervision for LMSWs in their practice. LCSWs are only allowed to supervise a certain number of LMSWs under the New York State laws. I think it's up to 5. And they ultimately are responsible. You are not responsible for the practice. They are. So they ultimately, if something goes awry, that LCSW is the therapist of record because you are under their supervision.
That's right. And yeah, finally from my end too, just so people are aware, if there is disciplinary action against people who operate outside the scope of the practice, you run the risk of having your license either revoked or suspended. There could be fines. There could be issues with your ability to enter contracts. So it is something for people to take seriously and to be aware of. And again, if people determine to go into private practice as an LMSW, really carefully defining that work. But even still, it can be really difficult, I think, for people to demonstrate that their activities have stayed within this scope of practice, as I see it, quite a few gray areas between the two. So do people have questions or thoughts? Yes, Samantha.
I have, excuse me, 2 questions. One, on the NASW site, they're talking about this interstate licensure compact. And so I wonder how that affects everything we're talking about today, if that goes through. And also, do I have to become an LMSW before an LCSW? Because LCSW is the final goal for me.
So yes, you have to be an LMSW before you can be an LCSW. Your question about the interstate compact is a great one. New York State has never in the history of the state entered into an interstate compact. So the chances of that happening in our lifetime are about 0. Not in any profession.
So we're
Yeah.
not one of the 17 states.
No, we are not.
Oh, I figured that, geez.
Yeah, I mean, that's not an us thing, it's a New York State thing. They have historically, they have never. Do I think it's probably wrong? Yes, but I think that the interstate compact, if it's attached to the ASWB exam, is also wrong because it leaves many people out of the profession. So I think your question is an excellent one. The interstate compact, it's funded by the Department of Defense, and really the impetus for the interstate compact was military families. And if you have social workers in military families who have to move, and then the social worker license, the licensure is so different in every state, and there's not reciprocity, and it's just, and New York State is one of the hardest states to get reciprocity in. And that's how it started, which I think is a very good thing. I'm the mother of 2 veterans, one of whom is a social worker. And so I understand it, but New York State has this very long history of not being in these compacts. And in order for this compact to become official, I think they have to have 8 states. They have 7. 7 states have approved it. Interestingly, mainly red states. But Yeah, I think that, I would like to be pleasantly surprised for New York State to, be in the compact. I think it would help our state tremendously. You know, I don't know if you have read about the New York State budget, and, you know, we have the worst out-migration of any state in the United States right now, and our licensure, for people to move in the state and get licensed as social workers is very difficult. So people have accepted jobs and then not come. Um, and so I think it would be something to seriously consider. You should be able to get we have some of the, most stringent licensure laws in the country for social work. So it would seem to me that it would be really great to have us have more reciprocity. You know, I have a faculty member who's a licensed clinical social worker. She's been a social worker for 20 years. She's practiced in multiple states. And when she came to be on our faculty, she chose to live in the state of Massachusetts. She could get her license in 6 weeks. Here, they told her she had to sit for the exam again after she was practicing for 20 years.
Oh, wow.
I hate to sell horror stories, but that is
Yeah.
one of them. So someone had something in the chat, and then I see Chelsea has her name up. I'm moving to Florida, and it's very hard to get a license as an MSW there from what I learned from the internet. So Chris, I I thought their licensing laws were less stringent than ours. But because of their governor, and they may be trying to, there are several states, because I'm on a licensing task force, that are trying to use what's happening with the AS. Oh, it's 3 years of supervision for an MSW. I think the question you would have to, the big question, Chris, is at the end of that 3 years, can you be a clinical social worker? It could be that it's the same law as ours with different, like it says MSW versus LCS. Do you know what I'm saying? And if you want, we can connect offline. I do know a couple of really excellent deans in Florida who could probably, if we wanted to ask the question, they would be able to point us in the right direction to who you should talk to. So now it's perfectly fine to give out my contact information to folks like Chris, so we can thank you, so that I can get them connected with the right people. Chelsea has her hand up.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you for this presentation. So I am actually about to graduate over the next couple weeks. And I passed my
Congratulations.
exam. Thank you. I passed my exam. I'm in New Jersey at Rutgers
Yep.
University, so I was able to take my exam in New Jersey this past semester. So I am actually relocating to New York. So I am planning on applying for my New York LMSW. I guess I'm asking for clarification on that timeline. Is it when my grades are submitted? Does my school have to submit anything, or kind of if you could give me some general guidance here?
So I'll chime in, and then now you can chime in too. In New York State, I'm dating myself. When I graduated in New York State, you could take the licensing exam in your last semester of study. With the passage of the laws in 2010, that was no longer available to you. I worked at Columbia for 7 years, and all of my students would cross the border into New Jersey and take their LMSW examination the last semester of study. I think if you apply in New York State, that exam still counts. You're not going to have to take the exam over again. It's just a matter of doing the application, and you're likely going to have verification from your school that they'll need your transcript, etc. But you already passed the exam.
Yes, so I guess the next step would be
To
to wait
apply.
until all my grades are submitted. I started the application, but it said, have you graduate? The first question was like, have you graduated from an accredited
Yeah,
university? And I couldn't say yes because I haven't
Right, so
technically
what I
graduated
suggest
yet.
that you do is you wait to actually graduate, you say yes, you tell them that you graduated from Rutgers. And then I don't know on the application if there's a place where you said you've already taken the exam, but then if they say to you, you can sit for the exam, I think then you say to them, I already did and I passed it in New Jersey.
yep,
Because when you get down into New York City, I know from working there for 7 years, this is the whole tri-state thing, right? And so people live in New York, they're licensed in New Jersey, Connecticut, and yeah, it's pretty common.
yeah,
Great. Yeah, that's good to know.
you need to have graduated before you can submit that application to NICE, New York State Department.
Yes, exactly.
And I dropped in the chat the LMSW sort of checklist and forms. So definitely take a look there. And that's sort of the New York State Department of Education. For those of you who haven't done the ASWB exam registration, if you're hoping to get licensed as well, you would also have to register through the ASWB. And that's the link there for that as well. So 2 totally different bureaucratic spaces, 2 different registration things, 2 different payment fees, all of the above.
Do you have any other questions? Very good question, Chris. So I do believe that in Florida, you do have to, so I promise now I'm not going to get on my soapbox, but you know, licensing and this examination I've been working on since 2015. So this is what I'm going to say. There are several states that no longer require the ASWB exam. California never did. California never had an initial level of licensing. They were like, if you graduate from an accredited school, your diploma is proof that you can do basic practice. They have an LCSW exam. In Florida, I still believe that you do have to take the examination. There are several states since ASWB released a report in 2021 that showed that their exams were outrageously biased. Only 49% of Black individuals pass it the first time. Only 52% pass if they're Latino. If you don't speak English as a first language, you pass, you know, at 50% time. If you're an older returning non-traditional student who may have worked in human services for a long time, you don't do well either, regardless of race. And so this exam is incredibly biased. There's no scientific evidence that taking this exam proves that you are a competent social worker. I believe that with the cost of higher education, you should not have to sit for an examination when you graduate. I am sorry. You have paid a ton of money to go to school. You have passed. You're in an accredited college. That is proof. I feel very different about the LCSW level because you're a beginning practitioner. When, you know, I tell my students, you're not allowed to hang your shingle up for 5 years because I've been in this profession 30 years and there's still things that I'm learning that I didn't know. So I think that, you know, we're working on it in New York State. It's a tough climb, but there are several states who have eliminated this initial level exam. Utah, Illinois, Rhode Island, California never had it. There are 18 other states that are trying to get rid of this initial level examination. It's about equity. You know, 85% of the clients that we serve are people of color. And we need people of color in the communities that understand the populations that they serve. And we did a survey in New York State of agencies. They all say they need to hire social workers. They desperately need bilingual social workers of color, and 65% of their applicants are white because they passed the exam. So I'll get off my soapbox now, but thank you for putting the exam pass rate analysis in there. And if you look at New York State, there are some schools that do really well with pass rates, including mine. But the schools who do well have mainly white populations. And it's not, the message here is not that Black and Latino and non-English speaking people can't pass the exam. The exam is flawed. Does not take into consideration cultural differences at all. There are certain things that you would do in a white Western culture that you would never do if you were Native American. You would never do if you were Hispanic. You just wouldn't do them. It's not part of your culture. So, okay, I'll get off my soapbox. Do people have other questions? And you can definitely reach out to me, and to Nell and to Dan if you have other questions. You're really important to our profession. We want you all. We want you all in New York State in our profession. There's such a workforce crisis. We need really good social workers. Any other thoughts?
This was just really helpful. I had no idea there was so much to this and how much we needed to know and all the licensing fees. It's New York. That doesn't surprise me at all. I'm really disappointed we're not in the compact because we really should be leading the way in that. I live in Batavia, which is between Rochester and Buffalo.
Yes, I drove by there. I was at Binghamton for 5 years. I-88.
Mhm. We are very rural, and a friend of mine is on services and couldn't get mental health services because we didn't have enough people in the area. So having a compact like that would be helpful. And I know a lot of places in the South that are very rural that don't have help, and that's kind of disappointing for New York. But thank you. This is so informative. I had no idea there was
Well,
this.
and we should stay in contact because upstate New York, I mean, especially our rural communities. I was in Bingham. I taught at Binghamton. I was the chair of the social work department there for 5 years. And some of our rural communities, first of all, they were farming communities, or they were, attached to Westinghouse, or some of the, all of our mid cities that were manufacturing hubs. And they're not only are there no services, but their communities are aging. So you have a lot, and my area is older adults. And so you have many very proud rural agricultural older adults who are not going to ask for help, and there's no services available to them. And this is a travesty. And I think that our governor is not recognizing what is going on in the real upstate New York.
Absolutely. And what you described is exactly my area. Farmers, blue collar workers, a much older population. And now with the cuts to Medicare, like what they're paying therapists is making that even harder. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's sad. And so I'm glad I know that there's all this to it, but I would definitely like to keep in touch. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it.
Yes, and the governor last year in an executive order announced her master plan for aging, which California is the only other state that has a master plan for aging, and she put together a whole committee, and it's co-chaired by the acting commissioner of the Department of Aging and the commissioner of health. But so she announces she wants this master plan for aging, and then she cut the Office for the Aging's budget by $1.8 million. And we are in a caregiving crisis. Our nursing homes are like in a crisis. So yeah, we have lots to work on.
Definitely. Golly, that was wow. The decisions of politicians never cease to amaze me with regard to our profession.
Our profession and our population. There was a scathing article in the Times Union about how short-sighted our budget is this year, and that there has been no attention paid to our significant out-migration.
Mhm. I know I want to move, so I get that. Thank you
Any
all
other
very much.
thoughts? I could just go on and on about this.
I can see why. There's a lot to say. Thank you all so much. I have pages of notes. Thank you for giving us the slides too, because that's going to be very important. I'm coming up on my internship, and so I'm trying to prepare for all the after graduation paperwork and stuff. One question, after we graduate, when we submit, so that we can start like earning our hours for the LCSW, how long does this paperwork take to go through when we submit stuff to like our academic records and things like that?
Well, Nell, you can talk about it from the NASW perspective. I can say a little because I'm the current president, but I can also talk from the school perspective. The reports that I'm getting about time of application of the Form 20, and when you hear from from the Office of the Professions that you can sit for the exam, can be anywhere from 1 to 4 months. Am I correct now?
Whoa.
It's correct. Yeah.
And then what happens is you sit for the exam, and then it could take 2 to 3 months for you to be notified that you have passed and you now are an LMSW. So I think that in terms of your documentation for your hours towards your LCSW, I mean, there's information on the website, and they're like, you have to, verify that your supervisor is qualified and all. You should do that. But I think it's a good idea to set up like even a spreadsheet or a table or whatever with your supervisor who is qualified to document everything, get that person's signature, initials, whatever, as you're going along. Because now more than ever, people leave jobs. You don't want to have to track them down later.
Yeah.
You want things in real time. Because we have heard horror stories about that too.
I will say that, yes, like those times are real. And a lot of people, if you are looking to do like right after you graduate, looking to do, sort of LMSW scope work, you can work with your employer if you have a place that you're getting employment with to apply for the limited permit. And you need somebody who, for that limited permit, you need somebody who is an LCSW to sort of be supervising you and basically sponsor you for that permit. And that, I forget how long it goes for. I think it's like a year.
It's a year.
So it can cover you during that like months of time between ASWB and then New York State Department of Education and then actually getting everything back and, all that stuff. So,
And so it's for 1 year, non-renewable. And I would, I'm a big advocate that, and when you apply for jobs, I'm going to need a limited permit, and you're going to pay for that, right? You're their employee. You're going to pay for that, right?
I'm glad you said that, because I don't know that I would have thought to ask that. Thank you.
And I would. Some people may say no, but if you go in under, will you pay for my exam fees for the first time?
Okay.
I mean, hey, my mother-in-law, she's an old Italian woman. She's 94. She says, Vicky, what's the worst thing they can say? No? If you don't ask, you don't know.
Yeah.
And you know what? They hardly ever say no to her. I've known her for 45 years.
I'll get her to come down on my job interviews with
That's
me.
right.
Thank you very much for those tips. I appreciate that.
Chelsea, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you for this. I had some other questions come up as we're continuing this conversation. So for the permit, now, if I'm not technically a New York resident yet, I don't know if there's any constraints for that. I mean, I will be a New York resident as of July 1st. But if I'm, commuting from New Jersey to New York, let's say, because I am in close commutable distance, if there's any constraints for that you know of.
Tell me where you are. I'm sorry. I was getting a book to recommend to everyone called Getting to Yes, and I missed the first part of that. You were in New Jersey?
I'm currently I'm a New Jersey resident. I'm in close distance to New York, close proximity. So I'm pursuing my New York LMSW, and I was referring to the permit. I heard somewhere that you need to be a New York resident for the permit.
Well, I think you also need, I don't know who your employer is going to be in New York State, but I do not think you can practice in New York State without a New York State license. Or a permit.
So,
So I think that, I mean, I don't know if I'm wrong now, but I think that to, like, for example, even like with telehealth, if you're doing telehealth, you're a licensed person to do telehealth in New York State, your clients have to live in New York State. You can't like have the snowbirds that go to Florida. You can't treat them in the winter. So yeah, I don't know what the rules are for being a New Jersey resident without a New York State license and practicing in New York State. I don't think you can practice in New York State without a New York State license or a limited permit.
so I do plan to get my license. Like I
Okay.
mentioned earlier, I'm about to graduate and I passed my exam in New Jersey. I was that person. I know I
Yep,
have my
yep,
camera
yep.
off, but so I guess like I'm just wondering if I say mid-May, I'm able to apply for my LMSW, but if there's like a waiting period to obtain my license, I guess some people said once I apply and submit everything and show them that I passed my exam, it should be relatively, a quick process, but I know that can vary based on different factors.
I mean, I think it can be, but as Nell said earlier, you have to have graduated before you can apply in New York State. And we do have people that have multiple licenses, right? They practice in New Jersey, New York.
Mhm.
But I think the important thing is you really can't submit your application to New York State until you've graduated. And I
Right,
think
I
you
understand.
can apply for the temporary license at the same time.
So I guess my question is, once I graduate, how long should I anticipate before I obtain that license number?
I would say 1 to 3 months right now.
Okay,
Right.
thank you.
Yeah, it's up to New York State Department of Education. Yeah, sometimes they're a little bit behind, sometimes, yeah, but 1 to 3 months is probably a reasonable expectation.
Do I think that's okay? Absolutely not. So totally not. Sorry now. I'm just being, I'm at the end of my presidency. I'm
Yeah, I
telling it
agree.
like it is.
Yeah. Yeah, it really sets people back, getting your first job out of school. Basically, you have to, you either have to work really hard to get the limited permit, and or take a job for a little bit while you get licensed that's not necessarily clinical, maybe doing case management stuff and wait, so it further delays. So,
I think there are some employers who know the lay of the land and they're like, oh, we're gonna hire you. You have like a year to get your license. And so I think these are important questions to ask when you interview for jobs.
hmm,
Like when I got mine's in the golden age, but you had a year to pass the exam.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm in a good place. I mean, I hope, since I already passed my exam and I'm on
Oh
track
yeah,
to
that's a good place to
graduate,
be.
but so I guess I shouldn't stress about it too much. And yeah, I'll have a month and a half after graduation until I move anyway, so there's half of that 3-month potential waiting period right there. So,
Right.
yep, wish me luck. Thank you for all the help.
Well, and you should stay in touch. The chapter is very interested in what's going on so we can advocate for people.
yeah.
Definitely. Thank you.
Oh, so Kristen is saying, I have one more semester to finish. Would it be wise to sign up and take the exam in New Jersey? I would say it depends on where you live. I mean, when I was in New York City, many of my students at Columbia took the exam in New Jersey. I mean, once you take it, you don't have to take it again. So, I mean, you can do that. I don't know, Nell, if you're seeing a trend. If you're in Northern Westchester, yeah, you may want to.
Yeah, I know people who do it because it's faster to take the exam and a less expensive, and then they can transfer from New Jersey to New York State.
Right.
It's a little bit of like a hack, and I'm not sure if you're necessarily supposed to do this, Dan, but people do that.
Yeah.
And
it
all of the
does
students
use
that I knew in New York
restrictions.
City did it all the time.
Yeah, now, and I help people who are going into private practice, right? And a lot of my clients live in or around the city and run into these challenges of where people are located, where they live, where they're going to get treatment. What if it's their home and you're in New York and it's telehealth? So there can be a value to having the multiple licensures. I see it in the long run as sometimes it can be a bit burdensome or kind of clunky, and there's a lot of things for you to do in terms of renewal and following regulations of different states. But certainly when we are listening to this presentation and thinking about how difficult it is at the start to get in, a hack can be a very good thing.
You got it.
Mm-hmm. So does anyone have any other comments or questions? Well, this has been really great, I will say, from my perspective. I just love interacting in this way. In case you didn't know, first and foremost, I am a social worker, a clinical social worker, and I have my other jobs that I do, but my commitment really is to people entering the profession. It is a very wonderful profession that has served me well for 33 years, and students pay a lot of money for their education and invest a lot of hours in internships and helping people in need. And we need to make it as easy as possible for them to get licensed and get good jobs. Damena, you have your hand raised.
Damina, hi. I just thought of a question. Um what's your opinion on using LinkedIn to network as a social worker?
Well, that's a really good question. And I'm on LinkedIn. I think it's a great way to interact with people. I would say what I would say to anyone with social media. You just have to be careful what you post. And, be discerning with the people you invite in. But I think it can be a great way to find out about jobs. Like on my feed, I get lots of information about jobs from people I know that other people might be interested, that I can repost and share with people that I think might be interested in those jobs. I think it's a great way to find out about opportunities. I think it can also be a great way to find a community, like of new social workers who are all starting out. Maybe you're in the same area, maybe you're all working in domestic violence or suicide prevention or child welfare. So I think you just have to be discerning, right? And I'm always very protective of students because of social media, because you don't want to put anything out there that some employer is going to find that's like, oh, I'm not hiring that person. So I think that LinkedIn is a very good resource. We just have to, and I think, we talk about this in our school, we have to help students be more discerning about how they use social media. Because our jobs really require it, because look, social work is under attack right now. If you think about our political environment and the upcoming election and we do really good work, but there are people who don't think that the people we work with are deserving of that work. Migrants, refugees, the homeless. So I think we just have to be discerning in what we post.
Yeah, I would just say too, for LinkedIn, going beyond the social work community too, and
Yes.
these other connections in your life, and for the different courses your career may take, it's great if people are kind of seeing your progress and seeing the different things that you're going through along the way. They kind of have a better understanding of what you're up to and where you're headed, perhaps. If you ever end up in private practice, let's say, that's an opportunity for you to be like, hey, just so you know, after all these years of work and in different environments, I've hung my shingle, and that might be some clients that come through those connections. So I definitely think students pushing that networking is a good idea, especially.
And I also think, Dan, I think what you're saying is really great. I think there are some social workers who maybe don't want to hang their shingle,
Yeah.
who are like, what can I do long term? Where can I go long term? And I think what LinkedIn provides too is like, oh, I could do that as a social worker, or I could do this as a social worker. Like I have some former students that I'm connected to on LinkedIn, and I'm like, wow, that's like a really amazing thing they're doing. And how did they figure that out? Like, so I think it also can present you with ways to think about how do you use your social work degree? Because not everyone wants to be hang their shingle. I think that is really important. We need people to hang their shingle, but then there are also social workers in all these other different places that, because different issues speak to us differently, right? And so I think LinkedIn provides an avenue for that too, of, oh, this is a really interesting avenue I could take.
Yeah, definitely. There's so much exposure. I am like constantly learning about people's jobs, the things that I would never think of. So it's true. It's an opportunity to get creative and yeah, network, learn more about other people. A lot of people are so like excited to hear that you're interested in what they do, chat some people up and see what they're up to. Maybe they have other ideas based on your interests. Always good to pick up some new contacts.
And what I'm finding with the new generation of students is they're willing to take risks that I would never have taken. Like my generation, you got the degree, you did this, you did this, you did that. But they're like much more entrepreneurial in spirit, and they're totally committed to the mission of social work. That's really not the issue. It's just like they're thinking about it in a more entrepreneurial way. And they're like, I'm taking this risk. What's the worst thing that can happen? and many times they succeed, which is it's so like invigorating. Doing amazing things to help humanity at the same time.
Well, awesome. Does anybody else have any final questions or thoughts they'd like to share? I guess I would like to thank you, Dr. Rizzo and Dan, for your awesome presentation and facilitation. We learned a lot today, and and I'm hoping that folks can take this and keep going and bring it to their friends, and share it with others. So if there's anything else you want to share, Dan or Vicky, last.
No,
I would
thanks so
just
much
say you
for putting
should
it
feel
on.
free. Oh, you should feel free to contact us. And NASW is a great resource in terms of questions about licensing. And if you're having difficulties, we really do at NASW try to track everything that's a difficulty so that we can report back to the Office of the Professions. These are the things you're doing great. And these are the things that we need to work on together.
And Dan, you were going to say something.
Just thank you. I think these programs are so great, and I love the attention to the participants and opportunity for people to weigh in. So thank you. I'm always learning so much when I participate.
Thanks so much, Dan. I finally am glad I got to put a name to a face.
I know, same.
Yay. All right, well, thank you all again. Have a wonderful evening. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out. I dropped the info email, our main email for the chapter into the chat there. So you're also welcome to use that as well.